Hello, welcome back to Teen Story Share. This week we're starting a brand new book. This is called The Raging Quiet by Sherryl Jordan. And it's about a young woman named Marnie. She's a teenage girl and she gets married rather unwillingly to a man who is over twice her age. And this takes place in a world inspired by medieval England. But not long after the wedding, her husband dies in an accident, and she befriends a boy from the village who everyone believes is mad or inflicted with evil spirits, but she actually discovers through interacting with him that he's actually deaf. So they become friends, and then later in the story they have to deal with suspicious villagers and a witchcraft trial. So I'm going to be reading 2 chapters every week for the next 3 weeks. Chapter 1. The afternoon Marnie came to Torcurra, the villagers were whipping the devils out of a mad boy. She knew he was mad by the way he cried, his voice high and unnatural, with no words but only strange, wild sounds. She had seen a mad boy whipped before, long ago when she was a child. He too had made those outlandish cries, and old women said later that when he had made them, devils with pointed tails flew out of his mouth. There were no devils flying around this day, however. There were only the Torcurra fisherfolk gathered in the stony field beside their cottages, howling encouragement to the man with the whip, and the screaming mad boy stretched against the whipping post, with his hands tied to an iron ring. Rubbing her dusty fingers across her face, Marnie looked the opposite way, toward the placid sea. The wagon jolted over the rough track between the thatched cottages, and she shifted her position to ease the aching in her back. Even over the rumbling of the wheels, she could hear the mad boy's cries. Struggling to shut them out, she studied the man sitting beside her. He was more than twice her age, with graying hair curling on his shoulders and a swarthy beard. Dark-eyed he was, with a careless self-assurance and a charming, easy smile. Sensing her eyes on him, he turned and smiled sidelong down at her. His hat sat on a rakish angle on his head, and under the shading brim his eyes were invisible, yet she felt them roving on her skin. "What things be on your mind, Marnie?" he asked. His voice was deep, rich, and warm like the sun on new-cut hay. "I'll be glad when we're in our new home, sir," she replied, not looking at him any more, but at the sweat-damp mane of the horse that drew the wagon. "It is through this place, in a little cove on the other side," he said. "But I'm stopping first at the ale-house. I have a mighty thirst after well-nigh all day on the road." Marnie bit her lower lip. Hesitantly, she asked, "Could we not get settled at home first, sir?" His smile widened, and he laughed a little. "'Tis sweet to see your eagerness, lass, but I have a need for an ale, and I think that considering your new situation in life, you might call me by my name. Call me Isake." She said nothing, but the color rose in her cheeks. Leaning down, she busied herself rubbing at a dusty patch on her long blue skirt. Isake chuckled, amused at her obvious disquiet. Though her black hair hid her face, he knew well what her expression would be like, with its bewitching mix of boldness and modesty. And she, with head bent and face aflame, knew how the laughter would be dancing in his eyes, though she dared not look at them right now. Always she had liked his eyes, and his voice. The first time she really noticed him, he was laughing. It was harvest time last autumn, and she and all the villagers had been working on his father's land to bring in the wheat. The work was done, and a sheep was roasting over a fire in the stubbled field for the workers to feast upon. Everyone was laughing, relaxed with ale and the sun, and tired from the long day's labor. Marnie had looked up, and there was the manor lord's son watching her. Many times that harvest eve she had felt his eyes on her, and later, when the stars shone silver blue beyond the flames, and the fiddlers were playing and the old folk were standing about clapping, he had asked her to dance with him. So overwhelmed was she with the honor of it that she could hardly bring herself to look upon his face, but when she did, she glimpsed those dark eyes laughing in the firelight and that roguish smile. She had been 15 summers old. "Let me hear you say my name," he said, bringing her back from the warm harvest memory. Lifting her head, Marnie looked at him straight. His eyes remained hidden in the shadow of his hat, but his lips were curved and almost mocking. "Your name seems strange to me, sir," she said, very low, "but I will call you Isaac if that's your wish." "My wish!" he exclaimed. "I've been wishing for it a year long, my lovely." "It wouldn't have been right to call you by your name, you being a lord," she said. "Besides, we never spoke enough for me to use your name." "True," he replied, laughing. "Not before your troubles began, anyway. Before then, you were always bent over the butter churn, or else busy milking cows, or head down, tail up in the straw, looking for hen's eggs. Mind you, they were all pretty sights, though not conducive to lengthy conversation. Still, we shall make up for that." Her face burned again as she thought of future summer evenings sitting with him in a strange house, knowing his eyes were watching her. Whatever would they talk about? Milking cows? Plowing? Sowing grain? But that life was forever gone, and she did not know, now, one thing they held in common. She pulled her cloak closer about her and tried to calm the quivering in her limbs. Isaac chuckled again, then flicked the reins at the horse, making the wagon bound over the stones. Marnie clung to the seat and tried not to bump against the man as they lurched down a sloping track to the beach. Once she looked behind her to see what was happening with the villagers and the mad boy, and glimpsed a priest running toward them. He was red-faced, furious, his fists raised, and the people were moving back, leaving the boy slumped by the post. The priest began to untie his hands, and Marnie looked away again, inexplicably relieved that the whipping was finished. For a short distance, the road was a stony track along the beach. Between it and the cottages scattered along the shore was a sturdy wall, the only protection the buildings had against the high and stormy tides. A few boats were pulled up against the wall, tied to metal rings set into the stones. At the end of the beach track, just before the wall petered out and the road swung inland to grassy slopes, stood a weather-beaten stone alehouse, ancient haunt of smugglers and pirates. The sign hanging above the door proclaimed the name, "The Sage and Fool." "Well, that's a fitting title," Isaac remarked, handing Marnie the reins and climbing down from the wagon. "We've seen a lot of sages beating the devils out of a fool." "Maybe we've seen a lot of fools beating a sage," she murmured. Isaac was yawning and did not hear. "I'll have an ale and be back," he said. "Stay with the horse. A village that has a madman is bound to have a thief or two as well, and all we have to live on, at the moment, is on that wagon." The wall was interrupted by steps leading directly to the alehouse door, and Isaac's boots crunched on coarse sand and stones as he strode up them. He was a big man, stalwart and tall and strong from laboring on his father's land. Unlike his two brothers, he had not been too proud to work, and the common people had loved him for it. He disappeared through the low door into the alehouse, and Marnie got down off the wagon and stretched. Never had she traveled so far on a wagon before, never been more than half a day's walk from home, and she was weary. More used to labor than to sitting still, her small body was shapely and strong. Her face was striking, with astonishing blue eyes and a forthright look that got her into trouble on the farm. Various youths, reading her boldness as brazenness, had at different times tried to grab her in the hay barn or behind the stables, and been soundly walloped for their trouble. Humiliated, they each crowed of success and gave her a name she did not deserve. They were one part of her old life she did not grieve to leave behind. Going for a short walk along the road, Marnie inspected the tiny fishing hamlet she had come to. The cottages were small and tumble-down. Built of whitewashed stone and with low, thatched roofs, they seemed dormant and withdrawn, as if centuries of battling against the sea had worn them out. Above their wind-swept roofs, the sky glowered, heavy with impending rain. Reaching the end of the beach track, Marnie peered past the bend to where a few more cottages crouched, unwelcoming and sullen in the spiky grass. Between them, the road led to bleak hills, then beyond to farming villages where Torcurra fish was sold on market days. Marnie remembered her mother buying Torcurra fish at a market in her own pastoral village of Fernley. Fernley. Marnie's heart ached with longing as she thought of it. It would be warm now in her home, the air thick with smoke and the scent of rabbit stew. Her 11 younger brothers and sisters would be making noisy fun of their afternoon chores, and her mother. Marnie pressed her fists against her eyes and swallowed hard. When she felt calm again, she walked back to the wagon. Isaac was still in the alehouse. Realizing she was hungry, Marnie reached under the heavy oiled cloth covering their belongings and took out a small parcel wrapped in white linen. It contained goat's cheese, fresh baked bread, and apples. She sat on a rock with her back against the wall, unfolded the cloth, and selected an apple. As she ate, she looked at the sea. Before this day, she had not seen the ocean except once from a great distance. The vastness of it frightened her, and she marveled that the water did not all pour away over the remote edge. Did it endlessly claw its way up onto the sand and stones, she wondered, to keep itself from flowing out the other way? Did it never rest? And what happened to boats that went too close to the far edge? She sighed, too tired now to contemplate such wonders. Enough that there was pleasure in the salty tang of the wind, in the wild cries of the seabirds as they fought over fish, and in the way the sky colors lay in a long ribbon along the wet shore. Finishing the apple, she put the remaining food in the wagon and climbed back up to her seat. To pass the time, she tried to imagine her new home. Isaac had told her little about it, only that it had belonged to his grandmother and had not been lived in since, and that it was worth more than all his father's lands put together. It must be grand, she thought. The skies darkened and rain began to fall. There was nowhere to shelter, and she refused to crawl under the wagon cover like a dog. So she sat there, pretending she did not notice the rain. People came running to their homes, and a few children stopped to stare at the stranger sitting on the wagon in the downpour. Their mothers hurried them inside, banging the doors shut against the weather and the newcomer. The rain fell more heavily. Marnie dragged her cloak over her head and looked hopefully toward the alehouse door. Surely he would come out soon to take her home. But he did not, and she waited another hour while the rain pelted down in torrents. It stopped at last, leaving her cold, angry, and soaked to the skin. Wringing out a corner of her cloak, she dried her face. When she looked up, she saw that she had company. The mad boy was standing between the wagon and the sea, watching her. Fear swept over her, but there were no demons crawling out his ears, and he looked too calm to be menacing. Curious, Marnie observed him. He was not a boy, she realized. He was a young man, perhaps a little older than herself. His eyes were age-old, sad, and an unusual violet gray. Long hair, dark as coal, shone wet against his pallid skin, and a shadow of a beard darkened his jaw and chin. His cheeks were bruised, and there were welts on his wrists from the binding, and his knuckles were raw. He had been cut badly on the head, and blood, faint-colored from the rain, ran down his shoulder and chest. He was wearing a ragged brown knee-length tunic, but no leggings or shoes. "Good day," Marnie said, and immediately thought it was a heartless thing to say to one who had just been whipped. But if her words seemed callous, the youth gave no sign of offense. He just stared at her, his eyes wise and knowing, the color in them melting with the sky, with the rain that still fell on the distant sea. "What's your name?" Marnie asked, smiling. The youth did not reply, but, seeing a rare friendliness, he stepped closer, limping on the sharp-edged shells and stones. Marnie could smell the wetness in his tunic and the blood and sweat on him. He looked hungry in his body and his soul. "Would you like something to eat?" she asked. He said nothing, so she reached behind her, lifted the waterproof covering, and took out the packet of food. As she raised the covering, water poured off it onto the mad youth, and he leaped back, making unearthly grunts. Fearfully, Marnie glanced at his mouth, expecting to see it contorted by escaping demons. But he was only laughing. His face was transformed, appealing, and something in it, in the look of him, tugged at her heart. She unwrapped the cloth and held it out. He took it in both hands, wonder in his gray eyes. "Take it all," Marnie said. "We don't need it. My man will be so full of ale he won't have room for food. Carefully, the youth wrapped the cloth about the food again, flashed her a stunning smile, then turned and hobbled away. The back of his tunic was stained with stripes of blood. "I'd like the cloth back," she called, but he ignored her. She watched him run awkwardly up the rough road toward the dismal hills, then sighed, stretched her cold and cramped body, and looked again at the alehouse. But no one came out. Other men went in, and sometimes she heard loud laughter and a shout or two. Day darkened to night, and the early summer air grew chill. In the patches of deep blue between the clouds, stars glimmered. The alehouse door opened, and Isake staggered down the steps. Chapter 2. Lurching, the man stumbled to the wagon and hauled himself up, swearing at his clumsiness. He belched loudly, grinned at the drenched young woman, then clicked his tongue and shook the reins. The wagon jerked on, turning inland to the hills. As they passed the little church and the last few cottages, Marnie glimpsed candle glow in the windows and heard laughter and the merry music of a fiddle. Shivering, she thought again of the warmth of home, and longing went through her like a pain. Her shoulder was touching the man's, and he felt her shaking and glanced sideways at her. "Not a word of reproach, my lovely?" he asked with a crooked, entrancing smile. "My first wife, God rest her tetchy soul, would have belted me over the head by now." She looked away from him and said nothing. She did not care about his wife, 4 years in the grave. Everyone said she was a shrew, even his sons and daughters, who were all married now. "You may hit me if you like," he said, slurring his words, "but not so hard that you knock me teeth down me throat. She did that once, and I had the devil's own job to cough 'em up again and plant 'em back in their sockets." Leaning close, he peered through the darkness at Marnie's face, searching for a smile. Against her will, the corners of her mouth twitched. Isake chuckled and leaned back, and they sat in a silence that was amiable enough, while the wagon lurched and slithered on the miry track. Soon the village was behind them, and there were only barren fields, broken by craggy rocks and low stone walls. The earth was ghostly, drained of color under the light of the brittle moon. Suddenly, Isake halted the horse, passed Marnie the reins, and got down from the wagon. He vomited noisily, then wiped his mouth on a handful of grass. Fumbling with the front of his leggings, he unlaced them to relieve himself. Marnie looked away, but even the sound of it embarrassed her. When he climbed back up to his seat, she handed him the reins without looking at him, and they drove on. Leaving the road, they turned sharply left, climbing a steep, grassy slope. The horse struggled, its flanks quivering with fatigue, its breath misting the cold night air. They came to the crest of a hill, and Isake halted the wagon. Before them lay a small cove, its waters silver in the night, the land around it black and rugged against the sky. At the bottom of the hill, almost on the beach and barely visible in the dark, was a tiny cottage. "That's it, my lovely," said Isake, and drove the horse down the slope. Marnie's breath caught in her throat. The dwelling faced the cove, and she could only see the end wall of it, windowless and rising to the chimney. At the back stood a small grove of trees. They stopped beside it, and Marnie got down off the wagon. "It's little," she said, staring at the front of the cottage, at the 2 tiny window holes overshadowed by the low thatched eaves and the thick wooden door. There was a broken step leading to the door, and weeds grew tall along the stone walls. "What did you expect, a king's manor house?" growled Isake, belching as he heaved himself off the wagon, the ale playing havoc with his usual alacrity. "You said it was worth more than all your father's land," she said. "Aye, so it is," he replied. Gingerly, she climbed the step. "Should we speak a blessing, since it is the first time we enter in?" she asked. He gave a short, humorless laugh and pulled the wet covering off the wagon. "It will need to be a powerful blessing," he said, "if it's to cancel out the thing she put on it." Marnie stood very still, while a coldness crawled across her skin. "What thing?" she asked. Isake did not reply, but busied himself lifting some of the belongings off the wagon. "Open the door," he said. "'Tis not all night we've got. I'm bone weary." Facing the house, Marnie said as solemnly as if she were in church, "Jesus, enter. Demons, go. Keep us safe in weal and woe. Guard us in our humble place. Don't let the devil show his face." She pushed the door and it creaked back on its ancient hinges. The stench of wet straw and musty air swept over her. With growing apprehension, she walked in and was engulfed by utter dark. Water dripped all around, and she almost slipped on the wet floor stones. Years of wind and neglect had destroyed half of the thatch, and she glimpsed stars between the rafters. Behind her, Isaac grunted and groaned under the weight of his large box of carpenter's tools. Staggering through the blackness, he collided with a wall and swore as he put down the box. "I'll fetch us a candle," he muttered. He went out again, and Marnie waited in the doorway. In the moonlight, she saw him search among his belongings, then heard him strike a flint and saw a tiny glow. Sheltering the flame with his hand, he came back to the cottage. The wavering light revealed dank, moss-stained walls, a wet stone floor, and a squalid fireplace gleaming with black water. Rough beams spanned the single room, and over one of them hung a sack, rotten and dripping. It was over the fireplace end of the house that the roof was gone. Marnie noticed, in a corner at the opposite end, a pile of straw. She realized it was the bed. There was nothing else. Isaac swore under his breath. "Well," he said grimly, setting the candle on the mantelpiece, "'tis not exactly the manor hall at Fernley, but I dare say we shall knock it into shape. It's as well you're a strong wench and not afraid to get your hands dirty." He started to go back outside, but stopped beside her. "Don't look so gloomy, lass," he said more gently. "I said we'll fix it up. Now, get a fire going and cook us supper." While Isaac continued unloading the wagon, Marnie went to look for firewood. On the far side of the cottage she discovered a small brook, and she cupped her hands in the swift waters and drank. For a few moments she stood looking at the beach, listening to the waves tumbling on the dark sand. Desolate and mysterious, the sea seemed alien after the homely farmlands. Gathering an armful of broken branches, she went back to the cottage and found inside a sturdy but graceful little table with 2 hand-hewn chairs. They were things he had made. On the table were piled kitchen utensils, a cast-iron pot to hang over the fire, and a long-handled frying pan. There was a jar of honey mead, too, a gift from her parents. Isaac was bringing in something else, and she heard him cry out as he fell over and the crash of pottery breaking. After a lot of panting and muttering, he came in and dropped a basket on the table. It rattled with broken bowls and cups, and Isaac grinned and scratched his beard with one finger, while he looked sheepishly at the angry young woman, standing with her arms full of wet wood. "Damned me if the ground out there didn't leap up and knock the basket from me arms," he said, his speech still slurred. Ruddy-faced in the candlelight, he gave her one of his irresistible grins, but she looked away and dropped the wood on the hearth. Isaac stomped outside again to tend to the horse. Searching among her jumbled belongings, Marnie found a broom and tried to sweep the slimy puddle from the fireplace. With mounting despair, she piled wet sticks in the pitch-black space and attempted to light them from the candle, but the sticks hissed and spat and would not catch flame. Isaac came in with the waterproof covering from the wagon. "You'll need witchcraft to get that wood burning," he remarked. "Then there won't be a fire tonight," she replied, "since I know nothing of such things." "I think you do, since you bewitched me," he smiled. Leaning down, he took the candle from her, and she felt his fingers warm and damp on hers. "Come, my lovely," he said quietly. "Don't hold a little drink or 5 against me. I was celebrating, and this place will make it right. Tomorrow I'll go into the village and get some straw to mend the thatch. It'll be homely soon enough. In a few days I'll go back to the manor and fetch us a proper bed and mats for the floor. We might as well be comfortable for the time we're here." "We're not staying here always?" she asked, astounded. He looked at her shocked face and laughed. "In this hovel? There's something I need to do here, and then we'll be gone. In the meantime, even a bewitched man needs feeding. Since we're not to have hot food, we'll have the rest of that bread and cheese we started at noon." He placed the candle on the table, then went over to the bed, spreading the waterproof covering over the wet straw, with the dry side of the covering uppermost. Then he spread out the bedding he had brought, his movements clumsy because of the ale, his shadow huge and black on the candlelit wall. Marnie watched him bending over the sleeping place, her emotions in turmoil. Isaac finished preparing the bed and came back to the table. "Well, where's the food?" he asked. "I gave it away, sir," she replied. He waited for an explanation, and she hung her head. "There was a beggar boy," she faltered. "He was starving. I gave it to him." Isaac cursed and wiped a hand through his long hair. "That's the last of anything of mine you'll give away, woman," he said. "I was thinking it was my food as well," she said, very low, "and not only yours." "Well, it belongs to neither of us now," he said, "and your beggar boy eats while we go hungry. At least we have the comfort of a little drink." He found a cup that remained intact, poured some of the honey mead, and offered it to Marnie. The mead was rich and sweet, and she took several mouthfuls before giving it back to him. He drained the cup, then went over to the bed and removed his fur-lined cloak, dropping it over the toolbox to keep it off the muddy floor. He removed his belt with its attached velvet purse and costly knife, and began to undo the gilt buttons on his tunic. Embarrassed, Marnie turned her back on him. She could hear every move the man made, could hear him take off his wet boots and drop them on the floor, and heard him grunt as he peeled off his leggings and linen shirt. Then the straw rustled under the blankets as he lay down. He said softly, in that voice like silk, "Come to bed, my lovely." Shyly, she glanced at him, hoping he would face the wall, giving her a little privacy to get undressed. But he was leaning up on one elbow, his dark eyes shining in the candlelight, watching her. Quivering, her limbs like water, she bent to blow out the candle. "Leave it," he said. "I want to see what all the fuss has been about." Slowly, Marnie straightened. Red-faced, she asked, "What do you mean, sir?" "You know well enough what I mean, lass. Now come to bed afore I fall asleep. I'm hellish tired, and the drink is playing havoc with my head." "I don't know what you mean," she said, confused. "I don't know what you mean by all the fuss." "For Christ's sake, woman, don't harp on about it. Your moral weaknesses I can overlook, but hen-pecking I will not tolerate." "My moral weaknesses?" she repeated faintly. "What?" "I said enough. Are you trying deliberately to provoke me? Now hold your silence and come to bed." She stared at him as if he were a stranger, seeing him altered by the ale, hot-tempered, belittling her with words she did not understand, and for the first time she was afraid of him. "Come to bed," he said again, impatiently. She replied, stalling, "I'll come to bed soon, sir, but I want to say my prayers first." "Then be quick about them," he muttered, lying down. "This isn't the Sabbath, it's your joyful wedding night." Not daring to look at him, Marnie sat in one of the chairs, her hands clasped tightly on her lap. Bending her head, desperate to find inner strength, she whispered, "Our Father in heaven, blessed be your name. Your kingdom come. Your will be done." "Nobody's will's going to be done tonight if you don't come to bed," growled the man. "I'm getting mighty tempted to forgo this uncertain pleasure for some sleep." "In a moment, sir," she said, and finished the prayer. But still her nerves were jittery, and she could not go to him. "Lighten our darkness, we beseech you, O Lord," she went on, "and mercifully defend us from all perils and dangers of this night." Isaac sighed heavily. After a while, as Marnie prayed, a sound disturbed her, and she opened her eyes and risked a glance at the man. He was sprawled on his back, snoring. With mixed feelings, she went over to the bed and stood looking at him as he slept. He was naked, the blankets drawn up almost to his waist. His head was on a pillow he had brought from the manor house, white as snow and edged with lace. It seemed foreign in this place. Dark hair covered his throat and chest, and his body was well-muscled and rugged like her father's. He smelled of sweat and ale. Slowly, She unlaced the front of her dress and removed her outer garments, placing them across the box of tools and thinking how odd they looked together, her rustic clothes and his fine ones. Though it was very damp, she left on her long homespun shift and crept under the blankets. Immediately she was aware of his body's heat, the strange and potent strength of him, and she moved as far away as she could, apprehensions rushing over her. Sleepless, she lay staring up at the stars through the broken thatch, listening to his irregular snoring, the wind moaning in the trees behind the cottage, and the sea sighing over the pebbles. The candle sputtered and went out, and somewhere in the dripping dark a rat squeaked. At last she dozed, dreaming of wild beasts howling and of herself pressed against a broken door to keep them out. But the door turned to smoke, and she felt the beasts swarming over her, suffocating her. Waking suddenly, she felt the man moving. He turned toward her, his breath hot on her face and stinking of ale and stale vomit. He leaned up on one elbow and looked at her, saying nothing, his breathing hoarse and uneven. She could not see his face except for the glimmer of his teeth as he smiled. Still clumsy from the ale, he fumbled with the front of her shift, undoing the ribbons that tied the two sides of the bodice together. She tried to push him away, but he moved on to her, his hands pulling at her clothes, ripping them. Crying, she begged him not to wait, that she was not ready. But he kept her quiet with his mouth over hers, his breath making her retch, his body crushing, overpowering. Afterward, he rolled off, away toward the wall, and began to snore. Curling into her side, Marnie lay with her back against his, her hands pressed hard against her mouth, so he would not hear her sobs of despair and disappointment and pain. Next time, we're going to learn a bit more about the mysterious young man from the village and about Marnie's past, what her troubles were that led her to this point, and how she first met Isaac. I hope you have a good weekend. Thanks for joining us on Teen Story Share. Bye-bye.